Female period in antebellum America. What we're looking at here is an ideal, the concept of womanhood in this time period, and how it played out both in white middle class women, and then we're going to end by talking about what it meant for enslaved women. This was very much a middle class ideal, and this is in the 19th century is when there's a new growing category that is the middle class. Earlier we really don't have something equivalent. There's the middling folk, but it's not the same thing. They are defined in part by the fact that they're sort of in the middle economically. They are mostly urban people, professionals, merchants, managers, shopkeepers, predominantly in the North, but also in the South. But they're also defined by new standards of behavior that focus on being moral, being devout, being influenced by the new evangelical society, and on the concepts of gender division. That there's this real difference between male and female that plays an important role in shaping society. Female virtue was a key element of this new ideology, and it was a symbol of the new middle class. We can tell that things were changing because there was a decline in premarital sex. And we can tell this because you can look at how many babies, when babies were born, compared to when people got married. And if you look at the revolutionary era, around the revolution, about 1 in 3 women were already pregnant when they got married. That goes on a decline. By the 1830s, it's only 20% of women, so 1 in 5 who are pregnant when they get married. And then when we get to 1850s, it's 1 in 10 women, or 10% of women are pregnant when they get married. So clearly, something is happening, something is changing, and the clear answer is probably premarital sex. They're having a lot less of it. At the core of this new idea of what it means to be a pure woman is that she is passionless. She has no sexual passion of her own. I mean, she will engage in sex with her husband, but that's basically to meet his needs and for reproductive purposes. She is not driven by her own sexual passions. As the British physician William Acton, who was widely read in Britain, but also the United States, Canada, France, wrote in 1857 that the majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. They have love of home, of children, and domestic duties, and those are the only passions that they feel. It's really unclear how this reflects women's actual physical experiences. I mean, we know there are indications that women did, of course, some of them experience sexual desire, but looking at those premarital sex numbers, it seems to show a decline in women's willingness to sexually explore, at least before marriage. That probably had an impact on marriage itself. It seems likely that at least some women believed that men had stronger sexual desires than women. Historians argue that this may have made it easier for women to reduce the number of times they had sex and thus reduce the number of children they had. If sex is something that you are doing as a favor to your husband or in order to have children, it might be easier for you to say, well, I just don't feel like it tonight, than if you were expected to have your own strong sexual passions. However, women were still seen as having an obligation to their husbands to provide them with sex. That was still part of a woman's duties. And there was no concept of marital rape. In other words, if your husband forced you to have sex, that was basically within the realm of you doing your duties. A woman who did become sexually passionate, who gave in to temptation, who had sex before marriage or outside of marriage, was a fallen woman. And she would be sexually transformed. She would feel passion. She would no longer be fit for marriage, was the theory. And that basically ruined her for matrimony. And a middle-class woman should be a pure virgin at the time of her wedding. And if she was not, that would be grounds for her fiancé to break the engagement. This picture is sort of a traditional image of the woman who has sinned and coming home to her family with her child that she's had in an unmarried relationship. And there her father is throwing her out of the house for her sinfulness. These ideas, though, were also tied a lot to class. It's not clear how far these standards went. So, for example, we know that some working class women who engaged in prostitution later married. So obviously for them, it wasn't seen as something that prevented marriage at a later date. But we also know that some women were seduced with promises of marriage and then, or possibly raped and then abandoned. So some amount of this ideology seems to be there, but it's different or more limited or slightly different than what we see when we talk about the middle class. In terms of clothing, for example, middle class women would wear almost a protective barrier of clothing. In fact, between the end of the 18th century and around 1860, women are wearing more and more clothing, more and more layers. By the late 19th century, women are wearing about 37 pounds when they're wearing a fashionable outfit. They also wear restrained colors, nothing too bright. Bowery girls, those are young women in New York City, working class young women who lived a little bit more out there lifestyle. They wore extremely bright colors, stood out. Similarly for behavior, middle-class advice books for young ladies told them they should never be alone with a gentleman caller. They should never walk too close to a man. They should never allow their hands to touch a man's hand. Or they should never reveal their legs. On the other hand, Bowery girls, we have records of them walking with a swing in their step and going out to events with men. So clearly there's class differences. There are also real differences in terms of race. Black women were stereotyped by whites as wenches. They were denigrated. They were mocked frequently. There's various satirical portraits you'll see of black women, which are designed to make them look foolish, make them look not properly dressed, immoral. And of course, in addition to that, the clothing that black women wore exposed them. At a time when women are wearing more and more layers of clothing as part of the fashionable look, as part of the look that shows their purity and chastity, enslaved women really lacked control over their clothing. They were given a certain amount of fabric or a completed garment that was usually drab in color, but it was also scanty in fabric and usually tightly cut to use as little fabric as possible in making the dresses. That meant that they were tightly clad. It clung to their bodies, and frequently they were not given outer garments. They didn't have undergarments. So they're much more exposed than you would see for a non-enslaved woman, black or white. This is not obviously what Black women wanted. If they had a little bit of extra money that they didn't need to spend on their family, what Black women often spent their money on was on clothing, trying to get something nice, maybe a party dress, maybe a petticoat. And you can sort of see these assumptions about Black women playing out in the naked exposure of their bodies. And this is something that Black men experience as well in slavery. But for women, they face at, for example, auction sales or other kinds of sales, they're stripped, they are touched, they are fondled in their breasts and their genitals to try to see if they're fertile, likely to be fertile, and are healthy. If they're engaged in punishment, or they're being punished, usually for whipping, women might be stripped totally, or they might have their skirts pulled up over their heads. And these are women who don't have undergarments. So they're basically being exposed by doing that. So that kind of public nudity was a frequent experience that sent messages about the impurity of Black women. And of course, there was the ever-pervasive sexual violence, particularly the sexual violence that Black women, enslaved women in particular, faced starting in youth from white men. Often the first sexual encounter of a young Black girl is going to be raped by a white man. But that pervasiveness of sexual violence and the fact that it was usually blamed on Black women, that it was their desires, their lewdness that was causing men to assault them, to rape them. And there were some times when Black women might actually tell the truth about the kind of abuse and violence they were experiencing. Maybe you could see it as a way of exposing themselves to challenge white complacency, to challenge white stereotypes. So, for example, Harriet Jacobs' memoir, where she talks about sexual harassment and threatened rape that she experienced starting at a very young age from her enslaver, and the fact that she is basically forced into making the choice to have a sexual relationship with another white man as a means of protection. She is directly challenging the white power structure by saying, look at me, look at what happened, look at the abuse and the violence of that. And yet even Harriet Jacobs, when she first came to Philadelphia from North Carolina, Underground Railroad conductor who meets her, who was a nice Black man, asks her about her husband because she has children that she talks about. And she frankly told him of the most important events of her life, was the way she described it. And he told her that she shouldn't be so open with people, lest she give some heartless people a pretext for treating you with contempt. So even when women are using these revelations to challenge their victimization, they could be used by others to try to reinforce the stereotypes about Black women and to try to shame them as victims. By the way, the picture on the right is Harriet Jacobs, and the picture on the left is Elizabeth Keckley, who was a seamstress. They're both women who escaped slavery. So what are women going to do, Black women? Are they going to accept this concept that they are not virtuous? And they don't, but they sort of have to redefine their concepts of what virtue means. So first of all, you have, for example, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote in her memoir, I had resolved that I would be virtuous, though I was a slave. But she's immediately then faced with the question of what does that mean to be virtuous? Her mother, her grandmother, who was a free Black woman, had a very clear answer for her: virginity until marriage. But Harriet Jacobs very quickly learns she just can't, that's not one of her options. She doesn't have that choice. So she and women like her have got to struggle with this question of, what does virtue mean? One tool is modesty. Mothers, grandmothers, other women try to teach young women to dress modestly frequently. The idea that this will be some kind of a protection. Now, it doesn't work necessarily, but the idea is how you choose to present yourself. And the way they're choosing to present themselves, as much as possible, is a challenge to white stereotypes about Black women and promiscuity. There is the fact that they live with the reality of this constant violence, but they choose to keep it private as much as possible. To use sexual privacy, what one historian called dissemblance or silence, as a way of keeping secret much of their personal lives and experiences, especially their experiences of violence and forced exposure, particularly because people could use these experiences against them. What was rape can be transformed into promiscuity by outsiders. And so you don't want to talk about it. You don't want to tell people. This is why, for example, mixed-race children might never be told who their father was. Their mother has decided not to talk about it. And in fact, women may have deliberately, as a form of psychic defense, tried to forget, intentionally trying to forget, to let go these experiences. And historian Alexis Wells Okoguma states that this is why grown children would not be willing to talk about what had happened to their mothers, what had happened to their grandmothers. That this was a way for not just women to try to let go of those experiences that shattered them, but also a way for the community to let these experiences go so they can weather the assaults on their psychological and social stability. So in conclusion, we have these concepts. First of all, this ideal, middle-class ideal of passionlessness, that women are not sexual. Good women are not sexual. And that seems to have influenced a lot of women across America beyond the middle class, though not always to the same extent. You have this concept of the fallen woman, a woman who is sexual, who has sexual desires outside of marriage and acts on them, is a fallen woman. She's basically made herself ineligible for marriage, is the middle class concept. There's the reality of the class divisions, that what it means to be a good woman is not quite the same thing for working class women as it is working class white women and Black women as it is for middle class women. And then you have the experience of enslaved women, Black women in general, but particularly enslaved women, where they are confronted with these hideous stereotypes that are used against them so pervasively. And they have to resist and come up with their own ideas about what it means to be a good and virtuous woman, to confront and resist the stereotypes that are placed upon them. Some of the sources for this, I use Stephanie Kuntz, Nancy Cott again, Keisha Etsy, or Esty, Margaret Washington, and Alexis Wells Oklahoma, and I apologize for mispronouncing her name.